Okay, so Genesis 11. That'll be pretty much our main text here this morning in Genesis 11. So kind of a very, very brief recap. It's been a little bit since I've been in here. So the last time we were in Genesis, we had just concluded with the story there of Noah and the flood. And so just a brief recap of what happened at the end of that so that we kind of understand why we're picking up where we're picking up. Right? God had responded to Noah's generation, the whole world. He had responded with worldwide judgment. That's what the flood was. And yet, in the midst of this judgment, as we saw last time, God brings about hope through Noah. He judges the world and saves Noah through it. And then through Noah, He offers this great hope of salvation through Noah and his family as they come and they pass through these waters of judgment by means of an ark. And so, as we see Noah and his family, they get safely through this judgment, and here they come out the other side. You see that God reestablishes his his promises here with Noah, and He tells them to be fruitful, to be multiply, and they're to go do what Adam had failed to do ultimately. But as you recall there at the end in chapter 9, you recall that as we ended with Noah, you end with his story. It doesn't really end on a great point in Noah's story at the end of chapter 9, right? The final story of Noah's life is one that leaves you with a very clear signal that though Noah was used of God, was a man of God, was a means by which God was going to bring salvation through the world, salvation was not ultimate in Noah. Right? Noah and his family get off the boat, but so too does sin get off the boat. And sin still remains, and God must continue now to act to bring about the redemption of mankind through the redemption ultimately from sin. And so as we pick up here then in our next section, this is our backdrop from last time. And as we continue, what we're going to cover here this morning is going to begin here in Genesis chapter 10. And then we're going to go all the way to Genesis chapter 12, verse 9. And so we're going to cover here this section of after the flood and after the Noah. And here we're going to encounter what I think is probably maybe the second, maybe third most well-known story here in the Old Testament, especially in Genesis. One of the most memorable stories here in all the Bible, and that's the Tower of Babel. So as Noah's descendants begin to spread out, they begin to populate, they begin to fill the earth. They settle in this place here that is described called the land of Shinar. And once they settle, what do they intend on doing? Well, they intend here to begin to build this great city and this great tower in order to make a name for themselves. And they say, in order to avoid spreading over the face of the earth, which God had told them to do. And there's obviously a big problem with that, right? The problem is that this is a direct contradiction to what God had actually just told Noah to do in Genesis 9, right? In Genesis 9, God tells Noah and his descendants, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. And here, these people, they don't want to do that. They want to avoid being spread over the face of the earth, and they come here to make this great city and great tower to their own name. And this ultimately presents itself as one big, great act of rebellion. It's one big, great act of people rejecting God, and by doing so, God brings about a judgment here in the story. So once again, we get this cycle of sin and judgment. However, this is not where the story is going to end today, and nor does the story really intend to end this way. Judgment here is not going to be the final word that God pronounces. What we're going to see in contrast with the story of Babel is actually God continuing to tell His story of what He's going to do to ultimately save the world. And He's going to continue this story with the call of Abram and the promise to use him to ultimately bless the nations and to bring about salvation for the whole earth. And so as we cover this section today, I want to use these two primary stories here in this section in order to contrast and give you guys clarity of what's going on. This section is going to have these two almost opposed different things or different peoples. On one hand, we're going to have the people of Babel and them building this great city, building this great tower, and they're doing so for their name's sake, not for God's, and they're doing so in spite of what God had commanded. But then on the other side, you're going to have contrasted with that this story of Abram and God calling Abram and what God's going to do through Abram. And you're going to get this contrast here, and it's ultimately, brethren, it's going to display for us God's plan to ultimately bring about, as we read there in Genesis chapter 3, this seed of the woman who's going to come. He's going to reverse the curse. He's going to roll it back, and he's going to end up blessing the nations and bringing redemption. So that's going to be our section here today, kind of going to be our main focus. And so as we go through this section, I want to break it up here in three simple parts. First is we're going to look at the rebellion here at Babel, the rebellion here at the Tower of Babel. What happens? What do the people do? What do they say? And we'll take a look at that. And then second, we're going to look at the judgment here of Babel. What does God do in order to judge this people? What does He bring down upon them in order to render justice here? And then lastly, we're going to look here at the call of Abraham. Why does Abraham even stand in this story immediately after the fall and the rebellion of Babel? So we're going to do those 3 points. We'll do them in order. And we'll go ahead and get started here as we look at this first point. So the first one, if you guys want to turn there to chapter 11 now, if you had your finger there. Let's turn to chapter 11. Look with me here at the first 4 verses. So first 4 verses here in Genesis chapter 11. Let's look at this rebellion here of Babel. So here's what the text says. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." So you notice right off the bat the situation that's going on here. People after the flood, what do they begin to do? They begin to spread out after this flood. And these people end up stopping in this very particular place called the land of Shinar, and they settle here. Now, initially that wouldn't be a terrible thing to do. People have to settle eventually. But the issue becomes why they end up settling right here, right? They decide they're going to settle in this place because they're going to build a city and a tower, and they give 2 purposes right here for why they're going to do this. So the first one is they say so that they can make a great name for themselves. I mean, they say that very explicitly right there, right? They say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves." So these people are all about making a name for themselves. And the second thing that they say is so that they're not spread abroad over the face of the earth. Now, I've already told you that this is a problem from the beginning, but the question you really want to ask yourself as you're reading the text and you're trying to think biblically, critically here is, why is that a problem? Right? Ultimately, why is that a problem that these people boast in a thing that they're going to do, and they boast for these reasons? Why is this an issue here in the Scriptures? Well, and the first one might be simple, because the first one we've already touched on a little bit. First is this. Recall Genesis 1 and 2. What was God's plan for humanity from the absolute beginning? How is humanity supposed to complete the task that they've been given? Are they supposed to settle in one spot? No, they're not supposed to settle in one spot, right? They're supposed to fill the earth, multiply, and subdue it. But in order to subdue the earth, they got to first go fill the earth, right? So man was created as an image bearer, one who bears God's glory, and he was to go over the whole face of the earth and subdue it for God. And then by doing so, God would look out over the whole face of the earth, and what would He see? Well, he would see his glory, right? Because he would see all of his image bearers throughout the whole earth. And this very same thing gets reiterated and commanded to in Noah there in 9. Noah is told this in Genesis 9:1. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them what? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so these people right here, when they say, let's build this city, let's build this tower, they are saying we reject what God told Adam, and ultimately we reject what God told Noah, even though God had just destroyed the whole world with a flood. I mean, these people are not naive, right? The greatest catastrophe in world history had just happened, and these people think about this command that God has given, and they act in direct violation of God's command. They act totally contrary to what God has told them to do. And ultimately, this response stands as one of rebellion. These people do not want God. But secondly, they say something positive about why they're doing this. It's not just we don't want to get dispersed, we don't want to do what God says, but what do they want to do? Well, they say this. And then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. And so this great city and this great tower that these people want to build, what is it wrapped up in? Well, it's wrapped up in these people wanting to be great. They want their name to be great. I mean, these people are trying to exalt themselves, right? In their pride, they think they can do this, right? The description of the tower is that its tops would reach to the heavens, right? And they believe that they can build a tower that's ultimately going to reach up to the tops of the heavens. Now, I know for all of us in here, we usually think, build a tower to the tops of the heavens, and we think, well, the Strat's right there, and it's in the heavens, right? It's like in actually a different part of the atmosphere, but that's not what is being said right here. The people were not like, let's build a really, really, really tall building because big buildings are cool and people think we're really cool. All right, the height of the building is really not important. But it's much more than that when they say, let's build a building to reach the top of the heavens. For these people, the reason why they want to build a tower so tall that it reaches to the heavens is that they're trying to build a tower in an attempt to exalt themselves to the position of God. Right? So this is not in the text here, but you go look at about what a bunch of people say about this text, and I think they all have very good thoughts here. There are other ancient Babylonian sources, right? In Babylonian, Babylon, Babel, these are connected. These names are connected. And there are these ancient sources that describe something very similar about this great building of a great tower, and they state very specifically in their own words what the tower was built for, right? They describe this great tower as this. Literally, the name translates to this, with its top in the sky, right? I couldn't pronounce the name if I tried. It was like in Akkadian or something. I don't know Akkadian. But it literally translates to the tower's name, its top is in the sky, and then they give the purpose for why they built such a tower. And they said, so that this tower would be, quote, a dwelling or a place where God's dwelt. Right, so if you don't know this in the scriptures, well, like temples, mountains, big towers, these are all symbolic of where God's dwelt. God's would dwell on the top of the mountains, and God himself describes himself as dwelling on top of a mountain. You think about Mount Sinai, you think about Mount Zion, you think about all these depictions of God. Where do God's people always go up to meet God? They always go up on a mountain. So this idea in the scriptures is not particular to the Hebrew scriptures. It is actually particular and universal to ancient people. This is how they thought. And so these people think we're going to build this great tower. It's going to reach up into the heavens because then we will be in the dwelling place of the gods. In essence, they think we'll be in the court of God himself. We will exalt ourselves to the position and the place of God. And the very name that comes from this later on, Babylon, is very explicit. You guys know what the name Babylon translates to? What its name means? Babylon means the gate of God. So if I'm coming up to Babylon, what am I coming up to? I'm coming up to the very place where God dwells. It's the gate. It's like the opening to the city. I mean, these people believe that in constructing this tower, they are really gaining access into the throne room, so to speak, where God dwells, and they believe that they have a right to exalt themselves to such a position. As brethren, when we put those two things together about what these people say, I mean, the problem should become very clear to us of what's going on in Babel. The issue with what these people are doing is they are full on rebelling against God. And that's why I said this first point is the rebellion of Babel. These people have a knowledge of God, like Romans says, but in their futility, they suppress it. They don't want anything to do with that God. They'd rather exalt themselves. And brethren, this story sounds all too familiar as we went through Genesis 1 through 3. I mean, this is what Adam and Eve are tempted to do. Take of the fruit, take of the knowledge of the tree and good and evil, exalt yourself to a position you are not ready for, and declare yourself to be equal to God. And these people want to do this, brethren. They want to exalt themselves and elevate themselves above God and usurp His authority, right? When they say, we want to build this so we're not spread out, they have zero intention to do what God told them to do. They don't have any intention of spreading out over the whole earth to make God's name great. I mean, think about that. That's ultimately what they're saying. We don't want to spread throughout the earth because we don't want your name to be great, God. That's why you made us, was for your glory, to bear it, to reflect it. We'd rather stay and make our name great rather than spreading out and making God's name great. Brethren, rather they settle for a city and a tower with their name on it that exalts them in their rebellion. And they want to ascend to the heavens. They want to be where God is. Brethren, ultimately, when we read this, we have to face the reality of what's going on here. The same thing we had to do in earlier parts of Genesis. This is nothing but pure, unadulterated rebellion by God's creation, and it has nothing to do other than pride and hubris, thinking, I will be exalted above God. That attitude. And so, what does God do? Well, God judges Babel, right? Let's look at verses 5 to 9. Let's look at this section to see what does God do in light of their response. So here's what it says beginning in verse 5. And the Lord came down to the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. And therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So immediately we get a response from God after these people boast in what they're going to do, right? And notice that there's, right at the beginning of this, there is a bit of irony and humor in this situation, right? God is said here to come down, right? God said to come down to see this city, to see this tower, as if God could not see the tower. The tower that supposedly what? Reached all the way to the heavens, which was a gate of the gods, And God is saying He's got to come down to even find this thing. Now, we obviously know God can see. Like, God doesn't need to come down to see anything. We know He's all-knowing. He doesn't need to come down and look to gain knowledge of something. But the description of God here is not one to speak of God's limitations, but rather it's to mock these people and what they're attempting to do, right? The description here is to mock the tower itself, right? The tower is supposed to be in the tops of the heaven, the gates of the gods, and yet for God, it's being pictured as so far away and so teeny and so tiny, so far from where God's actual heavens dwell, that God's got to walk down, He's got to go down the escalator, like, what's all the ruckus going on down here? I got to go check this thing out. What's going on down here? And it's God having to descend from the real heavenly abode to be able to even see this thing. God's response to these people is, what's all the fuss about this little tower right here? But it's more than that. God's response continues. The text then says that the Lord came down to what? To see the city. Now, once again, brethren, God's not blind. God doesn't lack some knowledge of this city. God knows. He doesn't have bad vision. He's not like he's got nearsightedness and he's got to get real close to get up and personal with this thing, right? The idea of seeing in the Bible is not so much about physical sight, what I see with my eyes, but it's about making a proper judgment of something. We talked about this a little bit when we did Genesis 3 in the fall of Adam and Eve. But here's another example of this, right? Here's another example just a little bit further in Genesis where God is described the same way. He's described as going down to see something in order to make a judgment. And God is described this way on in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So you guys can just listen to this. You can turn to here if you want. But Genesis 18, beginning in verse 20, here's another example of this language being used of God. It says here in Genesis 18, and then the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know. So once again, the example here is God knows the sin of Sodom, right? The whole story in Genesis 18 is not being set up for God to go down and be like, nah, nothing's wrong here. I was mistaken. I heard wrong things about this place. God knew, but God was going down because when God comes down, God makes a final verdict, a final judgment on something. And just as He went down, and we know what happens to Sodom and Gomorrah, God goes down and He makes a proper judgment of what's going on there in Sodom. And so too here in Genesis 11, God is coming down to Babel, to this tower, to this city that these people have built, and He's coming down to make a judgment. So what does God say then in His judgment? Well, God goes down and we hear this judgment in verses 6 and 7. And God says that these people, this is what they're doing. These people are all united in their rebellion, and they're united because they all have what? They have one language. They share the same words. Their union comes in their ability to be able to speak to one another, to understand one another, to be together in their speech. So God says these people, they're united in this rebellion, and they will actually continue in an unmitigated, uncontrollable rebellion unless God comes in to act. And God says that there in those verses. He says, behold, they're one people, they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they'll do. And so God's judgment then comes in order to thwart men from being able to think they can do whatever they want to do, right? Because when we read this language, what we don't want to think is God's like, oh boy, if I don't do this, they literally will do whatever they want to do. Of course, that's not going to happen. But God is speaking in such a way to tell you how determined these people are to do whatever they want to do, right? If they go unthwarted, they go unjudged, these people will stick together in one accord and they will do whatever they want to do with no with nothing holding them back. And so God's judgment comes here, and he says his judgment is to confuse their language. And so you recall at the beginning of this section why there's such an emphasis at the beginning of the whole earth had one language and same words, right? This union of language and speech gives them this ability. And so the Lord says, well, you guys are so prideful, so much hubris in yourselves. So he's going to come down and he's going to confuse, or a way you can translate this word confuse, he's going to mix, right? These people think they got all their ducks in a row. We're going to build this tower, build this city. We have one language and one speech, and God comes down, and it's just like, wow, that's a really nice card set you got there. It'd be a real shame if somebody messed it all up. And then God just goes, boom, and just messes it up like that, like there's no big deal, right? And the Lord achieves very quickly and very easily what these people actually set out to avoid, right? These people wanted to avoid scattering like the plague. And they think they're so good at scheming against God and plotting against God, they will avoid God and they will actually ascend up to where God is. And God, it's like in just the blink of an eye, confuses and mixes up their language. I mean, there's no battle here. This is not like other ancient texts where the gods come to war with the people and there's this big clash for power and this big clash for supremacy. God just has to go, okay, and he confuses their language. He messes up their playing card, so to speak, right? And verse 8 just says, so the Lord dispersed. Like, it's just that easy. The Lord dispersed them from over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city, right? God's judgment here is very quick and very decisive, and it's done so in such a way to show you how futile the pride and the hubris is of these people. These people think they're so great, and God confuses their language in an instant to let them know, you're nothing. You are nothing. And then in verse 9, you see what happens to this great city, this great tower. It receives a name actually for the first time. Right? Verse 9 says this, therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So this judgment here at Babel, right, it results not only in confusion, right, not only in the scattering of these peoples, but if we link this back to what's just come before in chapter 9, something else occurs from this great mixing up or confusion of language, right? If you go back to chapter 10, so keep your finger there in 11, we're not going anywhere. But if you go back to 10, and I don't know if you guys have read through this and thought, I wonder why this is the case. You read chapter 10, and this is probably why we forget this. It's this big, long, boring genealogy, right? No one likes the genealogies. But I don't know if you guys picked up on this. Every time you read through these sons, these nations, you know what each of them end with? So you have these descriptions of here, of Canaan, he fathers so-and-so, and they give rise to the Jebusites, and the Amorites, and the Girgashites, and all the ites come from these people. But then all these sections end with, these are the sons of Ham by their clans, their languages, their lands and their nations. And you get this repetition in 10 of languages, 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 languages. And so you'd be thinking to yourself, like, where did this happen? Like, how did this develop after the flood? Right? You're not really told. You're just given a description of peoples and nations and tongues and languages. And then we get chapter 11. And you realize, oh, okay, this is how this thing happened. So now that you go back to 10 and you see that, and now you read into 11, oh, you realize the description in chapter 10 actually just gets fleshed out here in chapter 11. And so we can ask the question then, how did distinct nations and peoples form ultimately? Well, they formed through the judgment of God, right? It's because people rebelled against God And God judged them by confusing and mixing their languages. But it wasn't that a bunch of people just scattered about like ants, speaking a bunch of different languages. What do you do with people who have commonality with you? You group, like you gather, you form bonds, right? And so from this different languages, this mixing up of language, you get this formation of peoples that get dispersed, and you get these formations of settlements in different areas. And ultimately, brethren, this is where we get this great, as this section in chapter 10 is called, this great table of nations. And it's because at Babel, people rebelled, but were united in language. And now, men are divided and still rebelling against God, even though now their language is divided up. And so you still got this big problem that's presented before you. Like, okay, God has now come down to judge these people. He's scattered them abroad, right? Not only are these people now going to be at enmity with God, which they are, but what happens now that people are dispersed into all sorts of different languages and different tribes and different nations, right? Well, people are at enmity with each other. Right? The Bible speaks of this constantly. Not only are we at enmity with God, but because we've been divided, so to speak, from our one common ancestry with Adam and with Noah, now as nations, these tribal peoples, we become at enmity with each other. So it's like the situation's already bad. We're at war with God. Not a good thing. And now, as we see later on in the scriptures, because of Babel, we end up becoming at war with each other because now peoples and nations become divided. Now the question you're thinking is, okay, well, what's God going to do? Right? Because the story can't end here. And we know it doesn't end here. We're like in the middle of a chapter still, right? What solution will God bring about to rectify the problem that's been caused by mankind's pride? And this is where Abram comes in here for our last point in the call of Abram. I might say Abraham a couple times. That is so hard to like keep those two straight when you're working through this. So this is where Abram comes in. So out of Babel, as you continue to read on there, in chapter 11, you get this genealogy of Shem's descendants, right? So this is one of Noah's sons. And as with every genealogy, they might be a little boring, but they're important, right? They're tracing out lines, they're tracing out lineages for you because they want to direct you towards a specific person. This happens every single time. And so after Babel, you get this genealogy here of Shem's descendants, right? And at the end of this list, you know who you get at the end of this list is you get Abram. And when you read it, you know, Noah strikes one way. You know, Noah, you read about Noah and it says, you know, Noah was a righteous man and he was above reproach and he walked with God. And you get like this really grand description of who Noah is, that Noah was like this faithful guy. In Abram, you don't really get anything like that. At first, you would not think much of this, right? But Abram is just kind of displayed here as he's like this normal guy in the midst of this list of this genealogy in chapter 10 and 11. And Abraham really strikes you at first as he's not really anybody special. Like, it's not described that Abraham walks with God or that he's above reproach or anything like this, right? Abraham is being presented as not a very special dude, right? He descends from unordinary people. In fact, he descends from a fallen line of people, his ancestors before him. And yet you pick up in 12, and it's like immediately Abram's on the scene, right? You get the end of the genealogy. It describes Abram, describes him and his wife, how they're barren and have no child. And then immediately in 12, now the Lord said to Abram. And so you get this idea of how sudden this call to Abram is. And I think, brethren, just this display for us of what God needed to come in to do, right? God was not waiting around for Abraham to appear on the scene like a superhero, like ready to save the movie, ready to save the girl, ready to save the story. Like God had to intervene, like drastically. Here's this list, this genealogy, and they're all dying still. No one's reversed the curse. And in fact, there are people in this genealogy who are probably not good people, right? These are people who just rebelled at Babel. And then you get Abram, and immediately It's the Lord said to Abram. And brethren, we just get this amazing, amazing display of God in His grace coming and awakening Abram and awakening his soul to the fact that He is God and calling him out from all of these other people in order to do something with him. Here in chapter 12, we're going to read here, God plans to pull a very unlikely and also a very undeserving and a very unworthy person, and He's going to pull him out so that He can use him to accomplish what He's been planning on doing this whole time since the beginning of Genesis. And what God says He's going to do through Abraham in this small section is standing here in the story as this stark contrast to what just happened in Babel. A stark contrast in what just happened in Babel and what connection God is making here for you to see what Babel was about versus what He is about in working with Abram. And so here in the text in Genesis 12, God calls to Abram, and here's what He says here if you want to look with me at these first 3 verses. God says to Abram in verse 1, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So notice what God says here first. Right? God first says of Abraham that He's going to, what are some of the key things He's going to do here with Abraham that stand in contrast to Babel? Well, God says that He's going to make Abram's name great. Right? He says there, "I will bless you and I will make your name great." Well, what was on the lips of the people in Babel that stands in contrast to what God says He's going to do for Abram? Yeah, they wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted to be great themselves. And so you get this really stark contrast here of Abraham in Babel. God comes down and says, "I will make you great because I've joined together with you." Unlike Babel, who wanted to make themselves great and prop themselves up to a position of authority. And so rather than self-exaltation at Babel, who is going to be the one to make Abram's name great? Brethren, it's going to be God. God is going to come in and to make Abram's name great. And what's important here is this comes out of nowhere, right? God's not going to do this because Abraham was already special. Wasn't because Abraham, hey, Abraham, you're like the cream of the crop out there, so I'm going to really elevate you because you're already great. I mean, Abraham was a nobody, right? It wasn't because Abraham was great that God intends to bless him and to use him, right? In order for Abraham to become great, he simply has to listen to God and trust God and then do what God says, right? What does God simply tell him to do? You got to leave home. You got to leave kindred. You've got to leave country. And you got to go to a place that I have for you. You've never been to it. You're going over in that place. And I have that for you. And you have to trust that I'm going to give that to you. And so all that's being required here of Abraham is that he has faith. Right? That there's faith on the part of Abraham. That he's got to trust in whose name? His name or God's name? Right? He's got to trust in God's name here. He can't be trusting in himself that this is going to happen because he's great. He's not great. He's got to trust in somebody's name, and he's got to trust God is great, who's revealed himself to me, and this God who's great can be trusted. And if Abraham believes this, God will bless him, and then God will make Abram's name great. So there's the first contrast here in this call of Abraham. A second, God intends to do something else through Abraham. He says he intends to bless the nations of the world who were judged and scattered, and he's going to bless them through Abraham, right? God plans to make Abram a blessing towards others. He says this, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And so here again we see what God's desire is and what God plans to do and what God will do through somebody, right? And this, I think, shows the heart of God here and what He ultimately wants to do. Babel is not where God wants to end this thing. He's never wanted to end it that, and He's shown that time and time again. He does not want to leave the world in the mess that the world got itself in. God, instead of judging people and judging those nations, rather desires what? That through Abram, they would be blessed. That if these peoples, these families, would align themselves with Abraham and his God, God will bless them. And through Abraham, He will be a blessing for them. If they bless Abraham, they'll be blessed. And if they recognize Abraham's God, He's God, and it's His promises that will stand, His future seed is going to be the one to bring about the promises, then God says, I'll bless them. And there's no caveats to this. God will bless any and all. He'll bless anybody who is willing to align themselves with the promise to Abraham and to Abraham's seed who's going to come later on. However, though, if they curse Abraham and they think little of what God said and do not regard God's promise, then they themselves will stand as a curse. And as we continue here in the coming weeks to make our way through Genesis, especially with Abraham's story, it's like this promise gets played out over and over and over and over again in every single narrative story with Abram in it. Those who align themselves with Abraham and bless him, you know what happens to them? They get blessed. And you know what happens to those who oppose Abraham and they oppose what he's doing? They get cursed, right? And this happens all the time. And brethren, ultimately, God is intending to use Abram and his future seed in order to do what He says He wants to do, that in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And brethren, this is the starkest contrast here, because this is directly counteracting with what God had to just do a chapter ago. God had to confuse and mix the languages of these people, and in doing so, nations were judged. I mean, when these people scattered, it wasn't like they just went to different geographical places, but still knew the true God. They were now scattered abroad with no knowledge of God. It's like God scattered them and left them to their own. And now God's telling Abraham that through him, He's going to counteract this judgment, counteract this curse that He performed at Babel. Because at Babel, they get judged and they get separated from God. But through Abram and his seed, once again, all of the families, all of them, all the scattered peoples can once again be blessed. And they can once again enjoy the blessing of God. And this is something, brethren, that I want to really draw out, because the New Testament makes such a big deal about God carrying out this reversal, so to speak, of Babel. Paul, New Testament writers, later on, they attest to this over and over and over again, that the promise given to Abram and to his future offspring, his future seed, who is ultimately going to be Christ the Messiah, Jesus, that in Him, in Jesus, guess who can be re-reconciled to God and be made right? Is it just one tribe of people, one nation of people, one type of people? Brethren, it's all. As the message of the gospel gets proclaimed, it's Jew and Gentile can become children and inherit the blessing of God. You think about what Paul says here in Galatians chapter 3. Know then that it is those of faith who are sons of Abraham. And the Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed. So then, those who are of faith are what? Blessed, along with Abraham, the man of faith. Brethren, it is through Abraham and his future seed, in identifying with them by faith, that this great reversal takes place. That though God had judged, scattered the nations at Babel, He intends through Abraham to bless them and to ultimately bring back these scattered nations into right fellowship with Himself. I mean, this is the great hope that gets traced now from Genesis 12 literally all the way into the New Testament until Jesus comes. It's like Babel stands as this great disruption of everything God was trying to do, and now all of the promises through the Old Testament are intended to rectify that problem at Babel. And in our New Testament reading, we see this begin to come to pass. Right? In Acts 2, the fulfillment of this promise begins to unfold. I want you to listen to this, because maybe you didn't catch it when our brother was reading it. But listen to the description here again of what's going on the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit is poured out on these disciples and they begin to proclaim the things of God. Listen to what is said here again in Acts chapter 2. I'm going to begin here in verse 1. When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire appeared to them and rested on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. So what happens here at the day of Pentecost? What's going on? Well, the Spirit gets poured out that Jesus says is going to get poured out so that these disciples can go and proclaim the kingdom of God to people, proclaim that Jesus is Lord. And so the Spirit gets poured out, and these disciples begin speaking in different tongues, or we could say different languages here. And then notice, as these disciples begin to speak in different tongues, different languages, I wonder what kind of people they're surrounded by as they begin to speak in these different tongues, begin to speak in these different languages. Well, guess what? They're surrounded by people who understand and speak these different tongues and these different languages. The next verse says this: Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from where? Listen, there's a qualifier here on purpose. It's not just from some, from every, right? Every nation under heaven, right? And so you get this illusion here in Acts, I think going back to Genesis, of when all these nations ended up being formed through Babel and being dispersed and under God's curse. And now God's people have been dispersed to all these nations throughout the years, and now they have come back to Jerusalem, and the Spirit's been poured out, and now you have pretty much people from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation gathered together in Jerusalem on the same day that the Spirit's poured out on God's people, and they begin to speak in other languages. And here's what it says next. And at this sound, the multitude, the sound is the languages being spoke, the multitude came together and they were bewildered. Why were they bewildered? Because each one was hearing them speak in his what? His own language. Right, so these people, they gather together at this noise and they're dumbfounded, right? because they're hearing people speak in their own tongue, their own language, who would previously not know this tongue. They're like, how is this, right? The next verse says, and they were amazed and astonished, saying, are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And the answer was, that is right. They are all Galileans. They shouldn't know how to do this, right? And how is it that we hear each of us in his own native language? And then you hear all of these descriptions here. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, Mesopotamians, Judeans, people from Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, Libya, Cyrene, Rome, Jews, proselytes from Cretans and Arabians, all these different people from, we don't have time to go through this, all sorts of different nations and places. People who, because of Babel, would have no ability to be united together around anything common, regardless of language. And now they begin telling in their own tongues from these disciples the mighty works of God. And it says, all were amazed and perplexed. So, brethren, the Spirit comes here and it fills these disciples up, and they begin to speak in the languages and tongues of those who were gathered from every nation under heaven. It's like God reversed Babel. He scattered them and made them, and then He's ingathering them and bringing them in. And even though they all have different languages, God pours out His Spirit upon the disciples so that they would hear the same message, right? The same good news. And at Pentecost, you see what happens in light of that. What happens to all these people who hear this good news? What do they do at the end? After the people get done preaching and teaching, they get baptized. Like, these people get saved. You see 3,000 souls from all sorts of different nations. They come in this great ingathering because they hear their native tongue spoken and they believe. And rather than the nations remaining scattered, separated, and without hope, the nations get brought back into right fellowship with God, and they get brought back as one new people of God, right? What was once their judgment, which was the confusion of their languages, right? Them inheriting their language previously was a judgment of God. It wasn't a blessing of God to inherit those different languages, but what was once their judgment has actually now become a means of blessing for these people, right? The promise of Abraham has been brought to pass through God sending His Spirit and speaking this message to all of these different people. And now, though the nations were walking in darkness, they now begin to walk in light where there was once confusion. And now they hear of the blessing that they can have in Abraham and his seed in their own language. And here's the funny thing, brethren. They may not share the same language, right? It's not like God gave them one language in this event, right? They don't share the same language. But what do they share now in this event? They share the same confession. They don't share the same language after Pentecost. That God didn't erase their languages and their nationhoods, right? They still remain these distinct peoples, but God now gives them a shared confession, right? Which had once been impossible after Babel for people to have the same confession, and now they confess the same thing. They say Jesus is Lord. So, brethren, as we come here to the end of the story of Babel, we want to be reminded of how this plays out here in the New Testament. And we want to think about what God has done because we stand in this story. I mean, we all stand in here, brother. Some of us might have some common ancestry, but I know we all don't. We can all sit in here now in the same room here together, and even though we don't share the same backgrounds, the same customs, the same peoples, the same nations, we now come to share the same confession of the same Lord. And so we think about the story of Babel, and we want to be reminded of what happens because we want to remember what God did, what God had to do in order to get us here, right? We're reminded of that rebellion there of Babel, right? Brethren, those people in pride and foolishness tried to usurp God and to ascend to a place that was not rightfully theirs on their own. And God will do something about that every time. God scatters them, and God abandoned them, and God will curse the one who does not come to Him and confess Him. However, through Abram, He would remember the nations, and He would give the promise that the one who blesses him will be blessed. And if He blesses ultimately His seed, Jesus, who's His Son, the Messiah, then he too could once again find blessing in God, even though he has been abandoned by God. And so as we think about this end of the story of Babel, we want to think about that ending right there. That though God brought about that judgment, brethren, He ultimately didn't leave it there. He gave His Son, the seed of Abraham, to come and to unite us again back to Jesus, back to Himself. So let's be thankful. Let's pray.